he fell in love with his wife, by Edward Payson Rowe. Chapter 11. Baffled. In the general consciousness, nature is regarded as feminine, and even those who love her most will have to adopt Mrs. Mumpson's oft-expressed opinion of the sex and admit that she is sometimes a peculiar female. During the month of March, in which our story opens, there was scarcely any limit to her varying moods. It would almost appear that she was taking a mysterious interest in Holcroft's affairs, but whether it was a kindly interest or not, one might be at a loss to decide. When she caught him away from home, she pelted him with the coldest of rain, and made his house, even with Mrs. Mumpson and Jane abiding there, seem a refuge. In the morning, after the day on which he had brought, or in a sense had carted, Mrs. Wiggins to his domicile, nature was evidently bent on instituting contrasts between herself and the rival phases of femininity with which the farmer was compelled to associate. It may have been that she had another motive and was determined to keep her humble worshipper at her feet, and to render it impossible for him to make the changes toward which he himself had felt driven. Being an early riser, he was up with the sun, and the sun rose so serenely and smiled so benignly that Holcroft's clouded brow cleared in spite of all that had happened or could take place. The rain, which had brought such discomfort the night before, had settled the ground and made it comparatively firm to his tread. The southern breeze, which fanned his cheek, was as soft as the air of May. He remembered that it was Sunday, and that, beyond feeding his stock and milking, he would have nothing to do. He exulted in the unusual mildness, and thought, with an immense sense of relief, "I can stay outdoors nearly all day." And he resolved to let his help kindle the fire and get breakfast as they could, and to keep out of their way. Whatever changes to the future that it might bring, he would have one more long day in rambling about his fields and in thinking over the past. Feeling that there need be no haste about anything, he leisurely inhaled the air, fragrant from springing grass, and listened with a vague, undefined pleasure to the ecstatic music of the bluebirds, song sparrows, and robins. If anyone had asked him why he liked to hear them, he would have replied, "I'm used to 'em. When they come, I know that plowing and planting time is near." It must be admitted that Holcroft's enjoyment of spring was not very far removed from that of the stock in his barnyard. All the animal creation rejoices in the returning sun and warmth. A subtle, powerful influence sets the blood in more rapid motion, kindles new desires, and awakens a glad expectancy. All that is alive becomes more thoroughly alive, and existence in itself is a pleasure. Spring had always brought to the farmer quickened pulses, renewed activity and hopefulness, and he was pleased to find that he was not so old and cast down that its former influence had spent itself. Indeed, it seemed to him that never before had his fields, his stock, and outdoor work, and these comprised nature to him, been so attractive. They remained unchanged amid the sad changes which had clouded his life, and his heart clung more tenaciously than ever to old scenes and occupations. They might not bring him happiness again, but he instinctively felt that they might ensure a comfort and peace with which he could be content. At last he went to the barn and began his work, doing everything slowly and getting all the solace he could from the tasks. The horses whinnied their welcome, and he rubbed their noses caressingly as he fed them. The cows came briskly to the rack in which he foddered them in pleasant weather, and when he scratched them between the horns, they turned their mild, Juno-like eyes upon him with undisguised affection. The chickens, clamoring for their breakfast, followed so closely that he had to be careful where he stepped. Although he knew all this goodwill was based chiefly on the hope of food, and the remembrance of it in the past, nevertheless it soothed and pleased him. He was in sympathy with this homely life, and it belonged to him, and he was dependent on him. It made him honest returns for his care. Moreover, it was agreeably linked with the past. There were quiet cows, which his wife had milked, clucking biddies which she had lifted from their nests with their downy broods. He looked at them wistfully, and was wondering if they ever missed the presence that he regretted so deeply, when he became conscious that Jane's eyes were upon him. How long she had been watching him he did not know, but she merely said, "Breakfast ready," and disappeared. With a sigh he went to his room to perform his ablutions, remembering with a slight pang how his wife always had a basin and towel ready for him in the kitchen. In the breaking up of just such homely customs, he was continually reminded of his loss. On awakening to the light of this Sabbath morning, Mrs. Mumpson had thought deeply and reasoned everything out again. She felt that it must be an eventful day, and that there was much to be accomplished. In the first place, there was Mrs. Wiggins. She disapproved of her decidedly. "She isn't the sort of person that I would prefer to superintend," she remarked to Jane, while making a toilette which she deemed befitting the day. "And the hour will assuredly come when Mr. Holcroft will look upon her in the light that I do. He will eventually realize that I cannot be brought in such close relationship with a pauper. Not that a relationship is exactly close, but then I shall have to speak to her, in brief, to superintend her. My eyes will be offended by her vast proportions and uncouth appearance. The floor creaks beneath her tread and affects my nerves seriously. Of course, while she is here, I shall zealously, as befits one in my responsible position, try to render useful such services as she can perform. But then the fact that I disapprove of her must soon become evident. When it is discovered that I only tolerate her, there will be a change. I cannot show my disapproval very strongly today, as this is a day set apart for sacred things, and Mrs. Viggins, as she calls herself, I cannot imagine a Mr. Viggins, for no man in his senses could have married such a creature. As I was saying, Mrs. Viggins is not all sacred, and I must endeavour to abstract my mind from her till tomorrow, as far as possible. My first duty today is to induce Mr. Holcroft to take us to church. It will give the people of Oakville such a pleasing impression to see us drive into church. Of course I may fail. Mr. Holcroft is evidently a hardened man. All the influences of his life have been adverse to spiritual development, and it may require some weeks of my influence to soften him and awaken yearnings for what he has not yet known." "He may be yearning for breakfast," Jane remarked, completing her toilette by tying her little pigtail braid with something that had at once been a bit of black ribbon, but was now a string. "You'd better come down and help." "If Mrs. Viggins cannot get breakfast, I would like to know what she is here for," continued Mrs. Mumpson loftily, and regardless of Jane's departure. "I shall decline to do menial work any longer, especially on this sacred day, and after I have made my toilette for church. Mr. Holcroft has had time to think. My disapproval was manifest last night, and it has undoubtedly occurred to him that he has not conformed to the proprieties of life. Indeed, I almost fear I shall have to teach him what the proprieties of life are. He witnessed my emotions when he spoke as he should not have spoken to me, but I must make allowances for his unregenerate state. He was cold, wet, and hungry last night, and men are unreasonable at such times. I shall now heap coals of fire upon his head. I shall show him that I am a meek, forgiving Christian woman, and he will relent, soften, and become penitent. Then will be my opportunity." And she descended to the arena which she should witness her efforts. During the period which Mrs. Mumpson had indulged in these lofty reflections and self-communings, Mrs. Wiggins had also arisen. I'm not sure whether she had thought of anything in particular or not. She may have had some spiritual longings which were not becoming to any day of the week. Being a woman of deeds rather than of thought, probably not much else occurred to her beyond the duty of kindling the fire and getting breakfast. Jane came down and offered to assist, but was cleared out with no more scruple than if Mrs. Wiggins had been one of the much-visited relatives. "The Heidi," she grumbled, "of having such a little trollop round under my feet." Jane therefore solaced herself by watching the cheap girl till her mother appeared. Mrs. Mumpson sailed majestically in and took the rocking-chair, mentally thankful that it had survived the crushing weight imposed upon it by the evening before. Mrs. Wiggins did not drop a curtsy. Indeed, not a sign of recognition passed over her vast, immobile face. Mrs. Mumpson was a little embarrassed. "I hardly know how to comport myself toward that female," she thought. She is utterly uncouth. Her manners are unmistakably those of a pauper. I think I will ignore her today. I do not wish my feelings ruffled or put out of harmony with the sacred duties and motives which actuate me." Mrs. Mumpson, therefore, rocked gently, solemnly, and, strange to say, silently, and Mrs. Wiggins also proceeded with her duties, but not in silence, for everything in the room trembled and clattered at her tread. Suddenly she turned to Jane and said, "Hey, you little baggage, go out and tell the master breakfast's ready." Mrs. Mumpson sprang from her chair, and with a voice choked with indignation gasped, "Do you dare address my offspring thus?" "Your what?" "My child, my daughter, who is not a pauper, but the offspring of a most respectable woman, and respectably connected. I'm amazed, I'm dumbfoundered, You're a bit daft, I'm a-thinking." Then to Jane, "Why don't you go and earn your salt?" "Jane, I forbid!" But it had not taken Jane half a minute to decide between the now jarring domestic powers, and henceforth she would be at Mrs. Wiggins' beck and call. "She can do something," the child muttered, as she stole upon Holcroft. Mrs. Mumpson sank back in her chair, but her mode of rocking but tokened a perturbed spirit. "I will restrain myself till tomorrow, and then—" She shook her little head portentously, and waited till the farmer appeared, feeling assured that Mrs. Wiggins would soon be taught to recognize her station. When breakfast was on the table, she darted to her place behind the coffee-pot, for she felt that there was no telling what this awful Mrs. Wiggins might not assume during this day of sacred restraint. But the ex-pauper had no thought of presumption in her master's presence, and the rocking chair again distracted Mrs. Mumpson's nerves as it creaked under an unwonted weight. Holcroft took his seat in silence. The widow again bowed her head devoutly, and sighed deeply when observing that the farmer ignored her suggestion. "I do trust that you feel refreshed after your repose," she said benignly. "I do." "It is a lovely morning, I may add, befitting the sacred day. Nature is at peace, and suggests that we and all should be at peace." "There is nothing I like more, Mrs. Mumpson, unless it is quiet." "I feel that way myself. You don't know what restraint I have put upon myself that the sacred quiet of this day might not be disturbed. I have had strong provocation since I entered this apartment. I will forbear to speak of it till tomorrow, in order that there might be quietness, and that our minds might be prepared for worship. I feel that it would be unseemly for us to enter a house of worship with thoughts of strife in our souls. At precisely what moment do you wish me to be ready for church?" "I'm not going to church, Mrs. Mumpson." "Not going to church? I scarcely understand. Worship is such a sacred duty." "You and Jane certainly have a right to go to church, and since it is your wish, I take you down to Lemuel Weeks, and you can go with them." "I don't want to go to Cousin Lemuel's, nor to church, neither," Jane protested. "Why, Mr. Holcroft," began the widow sweetly, "after you've once harnessed up, it'll take but a little longer to keep on to the meeting-house. It would appear so seemly for us to drive thither, and as a matter of course, it would be what the community expects of us. This is not our day that we should spend carnally. We should be spiritually minded. We should put away things of earth, thoughts of business, and any unnecessary toil should be abhorrent. I have often thought that there was too much milking done on Sunday among farmers. I know they say it is essential, but they all seem so prone to forget that but one thing is needful. I feel it borne upon my mind, Mr. Holcroft, that I should plead with you to attend divine worship and seek an uplifting of your thoughts. You have no idea how differently the day may end, or what emotions may be aroused if you placed yourself under the droppings of the sanctuary." "I'm like Jane, I don't wish to go," said Mr. Holcroft nervously. "But, my dear Mr. Holcroft," the farmer fidgeted under this address, "the very essence of true religion is to do what we don't wish to do. We are to mortify the flesh and thwart the carnal mind. The more thorny the path of self-denial is, the more certain it's the right path. I have already entered upon it," she continued, turning a momentary glare upon Mrs. Wiggins. Never before was a respecterble woman so harrowed and outraged. But I'm calm. I'm endeavoring to maintain a frame of mind suitable to worship, and I feel it my bounden duty to impress upon you that worship is a necessity to every human being. My conscience would not acquit me if I did not see to use all my influence. Very well, Mrs. Mumpson. You and your conscience are quits. You have used all your influence. I will do as you said, or as I said. Take you to Lemuel Weeks, and you can go to church with his family. And he rose from the table. But Cousin Lemuel is also painfully blind to his spiritual interests. Holcroft did not stay to listen, and was soon engaged in the morning milking. Jane flatly declared that she would not go to Cousin Lemuel's nor to church. "I don't do me no good, nor you neither," she sullenly declared to her mother. Mrs. Mumpson now resolved upon a different line of tactics. Assuming a lofty spiritual air, she commanded Jane to light a fire in the parlor, and retired thither with a rocking-chair. The elder widow looked after her and ejaculated, "Well, if she ain't the craziest loon I've ever heard talk. If she was blind, she'd might 'a seen the master didn't want any such a lecturing clack." Having kindled the fire, the child was about to leave the room when her mother interposed and said solemnly, "Jane, sit down and keep Sunday. I'm going to help Mrs. Wiggins if she'll let me." "You will not so demean yourself. I wish you to have no relations whatever with that female in the kitchen. If you had proper self-respect, you would never speak to her again. We ain't a visitin' here. If I can't work indoors, I'll tell 'em I'll work outdoors. It's not proper for you to work today. I want you to sit here in the corner and learn the 5th commandment." "Think you going to Cousin Lemuel's?" "On mature reflection, I have decided to remain at home." "I thought you would if you had any sense left. You know well enough we ain't wanted down there. I'll go and tell him not to hitch up." "Well, I will permit you to do so. Then return to your Sunday task." "I'm going to mind him," responded the child. She passed rapidly and apprehensively through the kitchen, but paused on the doorstep to make some overtures to Mrs. Wiggins. If that austere dame was not to be propitiated, a line of retreat was open to the barn. "Say," she began to attract attention. "Well, young'un," replied Mrs. Wiggins, rendered more pacific by her breakfast. "Don't you want me to wash up the dishes and put 'em away? I know how." "I'll try ye, if you breaks anything," and the old woman nodded volumes at the child. "I'll be back in a minute," said Jane. A moment later she met Holcroft carrying 2 pails of milk from the barnyard. He was about to pass without noticing her, but she again secured attention by her usual preface, "Say," when she had a somewhat extended communication to make. "Come to the dairy room, Jane, and say your say there," said Holcroft, not unkindly. "She ain't going to Cousin Lemuel's," said the girl from the door. "What is she going to do?" "Rock up in the parlor. Say, can I help Mrs. Wiggins wash up the dishes and do the work?" "Certainly, why not?" "Mother says I must sit in the parlor and learn commandments and keep Sunday." "Well, Jane, what do you think you ought to do?" "I think I ought to work, and if you and Mrs. Wiggins will let me, I'll work in spite of Mother." "I think that you and your mother both should help with the necessary work today. There won't be much." "If I try and help Mrs. Wiggins, Mother'll bounce out at me. She shook me last night after I went upstairs and boxed my ears 'cause I wanted to keep the kitchen fire up last night." "I'll go with you to the kitchen and tell Mrs. Wiggins to let you help, and I won't let your mother punish you again unless you do wrong." Mrs. Wiggins, relying on Jane's promise of help, had sat down to the solace of her pipe for a few minutes, but was about to thrust it hastily away on seeing Holcroft. He reassured her by saying good-naturedly, "No need of that, my good woman. Sit still and enjoy your pipe. I like to smoke myself. Jane will help clear away things, and I wish her to. You'll find she's quite handy. By the way, have you all the tobacco you want?" "Well now, master, perhaps you know the allowance down at the poorhouse isn't such as 'ud keep a body in what ye called satisfying smoking. I'd never have enough down to keep down the anchoring." "I suppose that's so. You shall have half my stock, and when I go to town again I'll get you a good supply. I guess I'll light my pipe too before starting for a walk." Bless your heart, master, you makes a body comfortable. When I smokes, I feels more at home and kind o' contented like. An old 'ooman like me ain't got much left to comfort her but her pipe." "Jane!" called Mrs. Mumpson sharply from the parlour. As there was no answer, the widow soon appeared in the kitchen door. Smoking was one of the unpardonable sins in Mrs. Mumpson's eyes, and when she saw Mrs. Wiggins puffing comfortably away and Holcroft lighting his pipe while Jane cleared the table, language almost failed her. She managed to articulate, "Jane, this atmosphere is not fit for you to breathe on this sacred day. I wish you to share my seclusion." "Mrs. Mumpson, I have told her to help Mrs. Wiggins in the necessary work," Holcroft interposed. "Mr. Holcroft, you don't realize, it never do. Jane is my offspring and—" "Oh, if you put it that way, I shan't interfere between mother and child. But I suppose you and Jane came here to work." "You will enter the parlour. I will explain to you fully my views and—" "Please excuse me," said Holcroft, hastily passing out. "I was just starting for a walk. I'm bound to have one more day to myself on the old place," he muttered as he bent his steps toward the upland pasture. Jane, seeing that her mother was about to pounce upon her, ran behind Mrs. Wiggins, who slowly rose and began a progress toward the irate widow, remarking as she did so, "I'll just shut the door twixt ye and your offspring, and then ye can say your prayers on the other side." Mrs. Mumpson was so overcome at the turn of affairs that had taken on this day, which was to witness such progress in her plans and hopes, as to feel the absolute necessity of a prolonged season of thought and soliloquy, and she relapsed without further protest into the rocking-chair.